Motown Detroit Get Out the Vote awareness concert.
Skip, you have 3 adult African American sons. What would your advice be to them about voting?
Well, my advice has always been to them how important it is to vote. I've always told them that voting is the most important tool that we as Americans are given, particularly as African Americans. I've explained to them the history of voting in this country and how prior to, this country was founded in the 1700s. Blacks weren't given the right to vote until 1869. And we as African Americans, it's really important for us to get out and vote, for our voice to be heard. It's really the loudest voice that we have.
What do you think about when people say they're not going to vote because our votes don't count?
When people tell you that their vote doesn't count, in my opinion, it's the most insane thing in the world. And if you just stop and think about it, if your vote didn't count, people wouldn't spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get their message out in order for you to come out and vote. If your vote didn't count, federal laws wouldn't have to have been put in place to make it where people wouldn't intimidate you to keep you from voting. Your vote absolutely counts. Your vote, every single vote counts. If you go back to the election, 2000 presidential election of Al Gore, where tens of millions of people came out and voted. That vote came down to under 600 votes. Under 600 people decided who went to the White House that year.
Well, I've seen pictures back in the day where the intimidation was on, where they had gangs showing up at the polls, knocking people upside the head, black people.
Let me tell you this, the formation of one of the most heinous terrorist groups known to this world, particularly in this country, the Ku Klux Klan, that was formed as a result of black people going to vote. When black people were given the right to vote in 1869, the Ku Klux Klan was formed to intimidate black people to keep from voting. People were lynched for just registering to vote. Medgar Evers was killed because he led voter registration drives. If voting wasn't important, none of this would have been happening. Again, people wouldn't spend hundreds of millions of dollars today to get their message out to attract you to the polls.
Do you think black people that say their votes does not count and they won't show up at the poll, do you think those people are scared?
No, I think it's a.
Do they use that as an excuse?
No, I think it's pure ignorance. And when I say ignorance, ignorance at its purest form. That's why not only am I honored to be a part of this, but I'm so glad that you're doing this, even if I wasn't a part of it, because you're kind of knocking down those myths, that ignorance, if you will. They truly don't know. They truly don't know. It's a form of oppression, really, when people would have you believe, that that the right to vote isn't important and your vote doesn't count. That's a form of oppression.
Do you think voting for the right candidate could affect our lives?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because not only is voting important, but voter education is important as well. So not only do I urge you to vote, but I urge you to get involved in the process by studying policy, studying what these candidates who are up for election and re-election, studying what it is that they stand for. Again, politicians or elected officials, if you will, control public policy. Public policy controls this world. Everything in your life is controlled by public policy. From the day that you're born, there's some lawmaker signed into law that made it okay for the insurance companies to tell your mother that you can only stay in the hospital X amount of days after you're born. When you go out into this world, the air that you breathe is controlled by elected officials. When you die, there's a politician, an elected official somewhere that zoned land that made it possible for you to be buried in. Your right to vote and who you vote for and what they stand for controls every aspect of your life. If you think it doesn't, then you're walking around here blind.
Can you explain to us how perhaps in local government, how the election of Coleman Young, how it bettered the lives for
yes.
Black people?
Absolutely. Something you asked about how, with the election in recent history, not too long ago, the election of Coleman Young in 1973. Coleman Young was elected in 1973, the mayor of the city of Detroit, first African-American mayor of the city of Detroit. And prior to Coleman Young, we had a few progressive mayors, Jerome Kavanaugh being one of them. But the city of Detroit, people talk about the oppression that people, the Black people, experienced in the southern part of the country. Well, to coin a phrase used by Malcolm X, he said, stop talking about the South. Anytime you south of the Canadian border, you down south in this country. And what Coleman Young did when he became mayor of the city of Detroit, listen, he integrated the police department. He integrated City Hall. He made it safe for Black people in this city, the city of Detroit, to go in certain areas. Prior to him, Black people were getting killed by the police. This is not anything new to us, what's going on now. Like with the death of George Floyd and the death of Breonna Taylor. This is nothing new. However, in the city of Detroit, I give you a perfect example of how the election of Coleman Young bettered the lives, not only for Black people in the city of Detroit, but for Detroiters, period, no matter what color you are. 1992 was a very pivotal year in this country. 1992, a Los Angeles motorist by the name of Rodney King was pulled over for a simple traffic stop, and he was beaten by the LA police unmercifully. 1992, that same year, here in the city of Detroit, there was a man by the name of Malice Green who was beat to death. Now let's do a compare and contrast. 1992, Rodney King beat up in Los Angeles. The police officers were ultimately put on trial and acquitted. They burned Los Angeles down. It was the worst riots in the history of the United States of America that year. Well, let's travel back to Detroit. Malice Green beat to death by two police officers. Not even a rock was thrown. What was the difference? Los Angeles police department belonged to a man named Daryl Gates. He ran the police department. He was allegedly a racist police officer. That was the norm in Los Angeles. They were used to being beat up by the LA police and shot down. Here in the city of Detroit, because of Coleman Young, because of the leadership of Coleman Young, we knew that was a total isolated incident. We didn't experience that. Thanks to Coleman Young. Now, had Black people not gone out to vote in 1973, it would have been altogether different. It would have been a man named John Nichols, who became, ironically, the sheriff of Oakland County for 20 plus years. He would have been the mayor of the city of Detroit, and it would have been business as usual. That's a perfect example of why it's important to vote, particularly during the times that we're going through now.
Okay. I have one more question. Can you somehow compare the oppression of Blacks not voting to apartheid? Can we tie that in?
Sure, absolutely. Apartheid, meaning in South Africa, apartheid was the law of the land. Again, I spoke about public policy. That was public policy. If blacks, it's the most sane thing to do is vote your interest. And when you don't vote, you're allowing somebody else to vote your interest. So blacks, we don't think for 1 minute in this country that we can't slip back into segregation and Jim Crow and even apartheid. If we don't get out and vote and we allow someone else to vote our interests and put elected officials in office who don't have our best interests, then we will slip off into apartheid or Jim Crow, segregation at best.
Skip, are any other members in your family in politics?
Yes, I come from a long, long line of politicians and activists. My dad, God rest his soul, he marched with King in 63, I believe it was, up Woodward Avenue, when Martin Luther King did the original I Have a Dream speech. I had a sister who passed away. She was very, very politically connected. I have pictures of her with Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy when I was a young kid. My brothers, I have a brother named Adolph Mungo, who's a political and media consultant. I have a brother named Larry Mungo, who's been on the political scene in and around the city of Detroit for the last 40 plus years. Well, my father's name was Eugene. My sister's name was Audrey. My brother Larry, my brother Adolph. I have a cousin named Leonard Mungo, who's a civil rights attorney, who fights tirelessly every single day against oppression. Also, my niece, Deja Vasquez, who I'm extremely proud of, has been active and involved in politics most of her young life. She just led a march over the summer for police brutality awareness. She also ran for office in Royal Oak Township, and I'm proud to say that she won a seat on the Board of Trustees there. In closing, in my opinion, it's the utmost sign of disrespect when you don't vote, especially African Americans in this country, whose forefathers literally were hung, lynched, burned, shot down, killed for just trying to simply enjoy their right to vote. So it's like spitting on their graves. When you sit around on election day and think up excuses and exercise those excuses, if you will, not to get out and vote. And so when you're sitting around and you're thinking about an excuse not to vote, I want you to also think about your great-great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father and mother, and your children, and your children's children. When you get out to vote, again, if you vote your interests, you're voting for a better world for them to come into. And I thank you so much.